Okay, welcome. Good morning. This is a lecture that's going to focus on a look at Genesis chapter 1. And there's two things we're really going to focus on in this lecture, which is part 1 of our look at chapter 1. First is the questions that chapter 1 attempts to answer, right? Human beings seem to pose fundamental questions to not just each other, but to the world around them, and demand satisfying answers about the nature of the world they live in for a variety of reasons. So what are the questions this attempts to answer? And that might, Genesis attempts to answer, and that might help explain just why Genesis says some of the things that it does, particularly in light of our obvious awareness that many of the things Genesis says are not consistent with scientific or historical fact, the Big Bang, Darwinian evolution, and so on. But there may be another type of logic which justifies exactly why the Bible says what it does. And this segues into our second concern, which is, what does modern science say about these phenomena? And we're going to discover two things: that on one hand, the modern scientific explanations of things, however accurate and however correct they may be, do not provide the types of answers that we're looking for in our lives as human beings, number one. Number two, one of the central focuses of the Genesis story in chapter 1 is to impress on us the fundamental mystery and the fundamental miracle of the existence of the world, the universe, ourselves, that anything exists at all. Why is there something rather than nothing? The fact that there is something that is positively miraculous. And when we look at these scientific explanations, and we're going to look at them reasonably carefully, this isn't a science class, but we'll look at them carefully enough, we'll discover that they have the same fundamental mysteries still lurking in them. Scientists have not solved the same fundamental mystery that Genesis is trying to explain. And it is as miraculous from a scientific point of view as it is from the point of view of the revealed religion of the Hebrew Bible. That's not to say science isn't seeking non-miraculous answers. But when you look at the answers science actually gives, you'll discover that they do not seem at this time, and I don't think they're, because this is all a matter of inference of how things began, right? Despite whatever evidence you may have, it's a matter of inference. I don't think they're going to have the answer scientifically. I don't think it's possible. Science claims to try to know everything. They don't claim that they will know everything. So let's turn to Genesis. We're going to focus on the mystery and the miracle of creation. And at the foundation of that mystery is two central elements, or are two central elements. Number one is that everything comes out of nothing. Everybody has probably heard in elementary or kindergarten or nursery school at some point that line, nothing, nothing, something. And of course we're all aware that nothing comes from nothing and something comes from something else, right? So how is it that nothing comes from something? That is a mystery and a miracle. The other mystery and the miracle is simply that there is stuff rather than not stuff. And I think if you really conceive of nothingness, it's quite different than what you would think. If you normally think of nothingness, you think of a vacuum, you think of empty space. But when you want to really conceive of what nothing is, or the nothing before the creation, you have to imagine there's, not only is there nothing in terms of matter and energy, but there's nothing for matter and energy to be in. There's no setting, right? And of course our minds boggle at that, because the only way we can conceive things is within the dimensions of time and space. When we conceive of nothing, we conceive it as the absence of anything in space, typically. Okay, so now we turn to the first 3 lines, particularly the first 2 verses of the Genesis story, that see the primary function of these lines seem intent on imposing or compelling us to become aware of the fundamentally mysterious nature of things and their origin, right? And there's some things that seem very intelligible here, and there are also some things here that seem profoundly mysterious, to the point of there are many elements in the Bible, as you see with Cass, that really can be quite logically and rationally explained. You can see a rationale at work. But some of the things here seem so explicitly to deviate from anything specifically intelligible, and that inability to make sense of it, I would argue, is not a flaw of the text or a bug. It's a feature of the text to remind us of our incapacity to fully grasp things with our reason. So when we get to Adam and Eve and later to Job, one of the great themes of the Old Testament and the entire biblical and revealed religion in general is the limits of human reason, right? And there are 2 things that are fundamentally ineffable for human beings as presented in the Bible. And something that is ineffable is beyond our comprehension. That doesn't mean it is lacking in logic, or that doesn't mean that it is lacking in coherence. It means that our minds are incapable of grasping that. So there's 2 things that we can't understand or are ineffable, and one is every aspect of the mystery of nature, or even ourselves, as part of nature, human nature, and then the mystery of the nature of God, right? God, by definition, in the biblical tradition, is a being who is beyond our comprehension. Our lives are not completely within the grasp of our comprehension. The world is not completely within our grasp, and therefore reason must take a subordinate place, be used in a restricted and restrained way, and therefore faith in God, particularly faith in His commandments, what He's told us to do, how to live, becomes absolutely crucial and the essential tenet of the biblical tradition. So the mystery. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Now, whenever we read something, almost always, our common frame of reference is our ordinary experience and the situation, the setting it exists in, which is just, everyday life and the earth and the world around us. Here, all those presuppositions that we can take for granted in terms of our experience as knowledge to draw on to make the text intelligible do not apply, because we're talking about a world that has not even become the world we know yet, right? In the beginning, there is a powerful claim in these first 3 words. And in the Hebrew, the Hebrew word is parashit, or barashit, and the word simply means beginning. So the first word of Genesis, which means beginning, the text begins with the word beginning, and the beginning marks the beginning not just of the story, although that's crucial, but the beginning of everything, right? And this raises or makes a major polemical point. It implicitly assumes or asserts that there, explicitly too, but we take it for granted, I think. It asserts that there was a beginning. It asserts that there was a beginning. And the first thing we ask of this story is, we want to know what it was like, so we're already assuming we're trying to figure out what it's like. But this raises the question, was there a beginning to begin with? The Genesis story and every story of the Bible, the people who crafted the wisdom that's in that story, they are aware, they are sensitive to your skeptical questions about the claims being made. And part of the story, the appreciation, the interpretation of the story, is to reflect on the claims being made and think about the alternatives and the implications of them. And then once you've done that, maybe you'll understand why the Bible is asserting what it's asserting. So, I mean, the mystery gets raised of, if there was a beginning, that means there was something before the beginning, but apparently there was nothing before the beginning. So how do you have nothing, nothing, something? That's rather improbable. That's miraculous. The fact that there is something at all is rather miraculous. In the beginning of what? Right? Beginning implies a context, right? But rather here, the context, or the setting, if you will, is being created. There's no story to happen. We're having the setting created, so then it can provide the living room for the narrative of human history and the Jewish people and the significant figures that play out in the story of Genesis. It says the earth was without form. We're not talking about the earth that we live on. We're talking about earth as in soil, and soil as in the stuff that Adam will later be made from. And what's fascinating about the Hebrew name for Adam is it's not a proper noun. In English, it's a proper noun. Adam. In Hebrew, Adama means soil or clay or humus, type of soil basically, or red clay, right? Earth. It's one of the primordial elements, right? Let's think about this for a second. In the ancient world, there are all types of explanations for what was the basis of the world. What was the basis of the world? And they gave the theory of the four elements, you know, earth, wind, fire, and water, right? Or Democritus's notion of everything consisted, the base unit of the substrate of the universe was atoms, right? Material things. Well, in the Genesis story, the base material of the cosmos, in a sense, is not a material matter. It's God. God is the ultimate substrate because he brings all these things into existence. He is the artist. He doesn't just fashion the Play-Doh or the clay. He brings the clay into existence out of nothing, right? So this earth is just undifferentiated, unformed soil, or what will become our planet. And then, of course, there's water in this primordial chaos, which chaos by definition means lack of order. And the first two things he creates are heaven and earth, right? What is the human being going to be or be created from? What is its nature? Is starting in chapter 2. We are a mixture of these two primordial substrates of the universe, heaven and earth. And it seems that these two fundamental substrates tincture everything else. God takes the clay, shapes it into a man, but then his heavenly powers, he breathes his spirit, or you could say the divine spark coming from heaven, originating from heaven, which is an immaterial place that is beyond time and space as we understand it. It's beyond our full comprehension. We can kind of characterize it and make representations, but those are just our way of understanding from our own terms, own point of view, and our cognitive abilities. But what is this all about? It was without form and void. There was just empty space, void, and darkness. There was darkness. And this is interesting because in 3 he creates light, right? Darkness was upon the face of the deep. Well, what is the deep? And what does it mean for the deep to have a face? And where did the deep and its face and darkness come from? Because what we first see is that God has created heaven and earth. And maybe these are byproducts of his creation of heaven and earth, but they're not explicitly stated. And you notice that everything in chapter 1, when something is made, it's pretty explicitly stated what's there, What does it mean for darkness to be on the face of the deep? And even more mysterious. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Now, think about the complication of that metaphor. The Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. It almost sounds like a reflection of God on the surface of the waters. The only problem is the Spirit of God is something immaterial, and the face of the waters, these are clearly material things, right? And you might ask yourself, where did this water come from, right? This is another great mystery. There's no mention of God creating water, no mention of God creating the deep to have a face, or water to have a face. Where did these things come from? It's mysterious. Okay, so we've gotten a little sense of what's going on here. And I think there's two things. There are consistencies in this story that I think are kind of wickedly rational in their structure. Not necessarily in their relationship to empirical reality, but in their structure, right? Then there are things that are so obviously ruptures from the logic of the text. Things that aren't explained. Things that don't fit, right? And, I mean, that's also a feature of our lives and the cosmos. There are things there that are inexplicable. We try to order and structure the world and our understanding of it, and there's always some element that's just not fitting into the matrix of understanding that we would like. You know, that's why scientists, they get a bad fact. They just leave that out of the report. I'm kidding. Okay. So, what questions does Genesis attempt to answer, right? And when I say attempt to answer, I mean it gives very clear and definitive answers about the nature and the order of things and how it came to be. So we've talked about some of these. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there something rather than nothing? This is not a question that we ask in our daily lives, and for good reason, and we'll talk about it in a moment. Nonetheless, the existence of these questions illustrates the fact that we have the ability to ask them and think about them. We have the desire and curiosity to want to know about them. And perhaps even we need to ask them. And not only do we need to ask them, we need to provide answers for ourselves to them. And what's the great problem? It's very hard to come up with answers to these questions. And yet, maybe for the sake of our lives and our psychological well-being and our orientation in the world, we need to have some degree of certainty about the answers to these questions. Number two, implied, the question is, was there a beginning? As we look at this, we'll see that the very concept or phenomena of a beginning of everything is highly, highly problematic from the common sense, logical point of view. Next, the question, what is there? What is all of this? What is all this? Once we know that there's something, what does it consist of? Particularly, what are all the variegated types of beings, right? So if you read through chapter 1, Genesis 1, you see all the kind of essential, you might say, character types of beings, from heaven and earth, to light to dark, to moon and sun, to fish and fowl, to man and woman, to grasses, and so on and so forth. And it fleshes out in a schematic way what seem to be all the essential beings, and also insinuates something very subtly about their natures. They all have different natures. From God has one nature, heaven and earth have another nature, and then the planets as they move, the sun and the moon have another nature. Animals have another type of nature. And then human beings, the kind of pinnacle of the creation, then again have another type of nature. Right? So different types of beings. That's what's being answered when we ask the question, what is there? How did things come to be? Right? It's a Genesis story. It's an origin myth. Answers two questions. Both the final and what are called the efficient cause, the final and efficient cause. So these two concepts of cause or causation come from Aristotle, and he posited 4 different types of causes that operate in the world, right? And 2 of them, one was a final and one was efficient. These are the ones we need to focus on for our purposes. An efficient cause is what you understand in science or everyday life. The efficient cause is the cause that produces the effect, which is to say it is the cause that produces the immediate effect, right? So if I ask you why you're eating breakfast, you say, because I slept all last night and didn't eat, and now I am hungry. The immediate efficient cause that compels you to have breakfast, right? But if I ask you why you're living your entire life the way you are, I'm asking not for some specific cause at that moment. I'm asking for a kind of global cause that drives your entire life and all your conduct, all your behaviors, all your actions. And to speak of a final cause is what Aristotle called a telos. It was understood as an end or a goal or a purpose. It was the target at which all your actions aim, or it was the target at which any type of being, all its movements or actions or its growth and development aim, right? And we would call it a purpose, right? You're not, when you say, I'm eating breakfast, you're not saying it because it is my purpose in life to eat breakfast. You're saying I'm eating breakfast because I just need to eat breakfast now. It's what I do, but it doesn't encompass everything that I want. And in fact, eating breakfast is going to contribute to the larger purpose. And when you talk about a final cause or a purpose, I mean, you're talking about something like the meaning of life that motivates you or motivates mankind or society to get up and do what it does in the totality of its actions, what its larger aim really is. Because we have all these subordinate aims that are caused by subordinate causes. Interestingly, this issue of a final cause, which was once taken up by Aristotle and medieval philosophers, theologians, was dropped by modern science. It's one of the fundamental causes that they explicitly stated during the scientific revolution that we cannot and we don't claim to and we aren't interested and we should not attempt to answer the question of something like a final cause. We deal in the science, as science by definition is the science of efficient causes. And actually scientists today and for the last several hundred years, varying degrees and different ones, have said the very asking of what your final cause is, what your purpose is here, is the wrong question. It's not a legitimate question. It doesn't have an answer. This is a kind of category mistake. This is a misapplication of language. It's not the kind of question we can ask of the natural world, right? Because only human beings have purposes. That's their statement. I mean, what is the final cause of everything here? It's God, right, and His plan, right? What is the structure of it all, right? We have a desire to understand and put things in an order, and we hope that when we observe the universe that it has order and structure. And of course, at the end of chapter 1 of Genesis, you see a highly ordered, a highly structured cosmos and planet. And this may have something to do with why God calls it good, and then later on, very good at the end of the 6th day. The interesting thing is, when we look at chapter 3 in the fall, we'll see an undermining of the perfect harmony and order that's established in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. Where does it all come from, and how do I fit in? Right? It's fundamental questions posed by Origen's myths. Again, number 7, a question that science doesn't attempt to answer, and we'll look at this more later. What is the worth? What is the status? What is the meaning or value of things? Right? We saw, and we will continue to see, the way in which there is a hierarchical structure in which things at the top superior, they're more powerful, they're more divine, and they're of greater dignity and worth, of status. And as we go down the great chain of being, we will tend toward things that are less powerful, less important, less significant, and of lesser worth, right? And of course, human beings end up fitting somewhere in the middle. So here is this wonderful late 19th century painting by Paul Gauguin, a Catholic himself, who was really steeped in the basics of the Bible as a Catholic, and would have, it's no surprise that he reflects on these basic questions as applied to the Tahitians that he was living with for a period of time, obviously in Tahiti. So here he makes a painting of the native Tahitians, and he asks the kind of questions that myth asks, right? Where do we come from? Where are we going? What are we? Well, let me say, where do we come from? What are we? And where are we going? Right? These are the questions that any human being needs to answer, and not just for theoretical reasons or for the sake of knowledge, but because they need to know for their own identity, for their own sense of worth, for their own sense of direction in their lives, right? So these questions that could seem abstract or theoretical, kind of purely scientific with no concern for the everyday life, turn out to be absolutely necessary for our own identity. You think of the child who is adopted, who yearns to know who their real parents are, right? You can think about why that is. They need to know in a profound way. So questions. This is what an origin myth poses. An origin myth is a narrative of our identity. It's a narrative, a counter-explanation of the core mysteries of human experience, designed to answer three questions. Who are we? What is this world? And what is our relationship to the world? So in Genesis 1 and 2, you get all three of these questions answered, starting with what is the world, who are we, and then what is our relationship to the world. And by chapter 3, of course, with the fall, there is a transformation of our relationship with each other, with God, to ourselves, and of course to the natural world as well. Now we pose a really important question that indirectly we've already started to answer, but what are the human causes of our attempt to provide such accounts as origin myths, given how central they are in ancient literature? And, I've heard it said by scholars that the essence of the 20th century novel, particularly the late 20th century novel in America, is that the novel is being used as a search for individual identity. In a society that's diverse, in a society that is plural and accepts a variety of ways and doesn't necessarily endorse one, and certainly because it's democratic, it doesn't endorse one over the other. We're all searching to clarify who we are, particularly as a nation of immigrants who come from other places, and we simultaneously recognize that we carry a certain baggage, good and bad, from a previous country, but then we also realize that not only do we have the possibility in America of assimilating, but we have the possibility of assimilating to a culture that allows us to assimilate in a whole variety of ways. And we engage in a certain degree of godlike self-creation, right? So this need of knowledge about our identity is just as evident in ancient poetry, biblical literature, as it is in the modern novel, right? So the question is, what motivates us to tell these stories? And some of the key things I think that motivate us are, number one, we have the ability to tell them, right? We are the rational animal with reason and speech, and since we have this capacity, we tend to do it. Next one, fear, right? Fear of the unknown. The questions being posed here are posed precisely because these things are not self-evident. If they were self-evident, we wouldn't be asking these questions, right? And there's a profound fear, therefore, of the unknown. And we need to make the unknown known as best we can. And this might also explain why the Genesis story is so cut and dried in the way it claims to be able to know everything with a degree of certainty as the result of revelation that's clearly lacking in science. Science precisely doesn't claim the kind of certainty that revelation claims. Another, we have a need for order, coherence, and meaning. Is the cosmos as orderly as it's described in Genesis 1? I think the answer is no. I mean, there's a perfect balance, there's a perfect harmony, there's a yin-yang here and a perfect hierarchy. You've got perfect kind of dyads going across, but then they're all in a hierarchy. The cosmos involves a little I am familiar with cosmology. It's in much greater state of fluctuation, right, than what we see in chapter 1. It's much less coherent, obviously, in terms of spatial orientation. We see that in Genesis 1, what is established is this, the cardinal points of the compass are established with a dome on top. The earth is actually a flat surface on the bottom. For all you flat earthers, you'll love that. And it's held up by pillars down below. And it all has an up-down, left-right orientation, which, of course, if you look at pictures of the galaxy and whatnot, I mean, it's like there is, you know, up is down and down is up and left is right. There is no fixed orientation. There is no guidepost that would give us that fixed orientation. So we need to give coherence to maybe a world that is not sufficiently coherent. It's too chaotic for psychologically for us to accept as is. And then, you know, last, obviously, curiosity, right? We are the being that is capable of knowing, and therefore we want to know. We want to use our faculties, our powers of mind. Aristotle, in Book 1 of the Metaphysics, says very simply, in light of what a human being is, a rational animal, all human beings desire to know, right? Now, here's the interesting thing of Genesis and the Bible. The message of Genesis is beware what you seek to know. Beware the extent to which you think you can rely on reason, right? Reason cannot be your final authority. And yet, the biblical tales, particularly Genesis, but all of them, are profoundly aware of our desire to use our faculties. They're profoundly aware of our curiosity. Look at Eve. I mean, what kind of story, if this story wants to be dogmatic, presents the image of someone transgressing against God's will as really the first thing human beings do, which sets them on the way to the world that we know and understand? The people who wrote this story and who developed this story actually clearly have a profound respect for the natural, rational abilities of the human being and our natural inclinations to be curious as a result of them. So the Genesis story reveals our psychological need for such a story. And really science, I mean, what motivates science? Knowledge, a desire for knowledge. Obviously, there's practical benefits that come from science. But then, of course, science is motivated by our need to make, to find coherence, to find order. And if you look at scientists, many of them really obsessed with the notion that the cosmos or the universe is perfectly intelligible. It is capable of being completely transparent to the mind, right? Nonetheless, science doesn't always succeed in achieving that, or rarely in certain disciplines achieves that. But yet, for us to live, we need that structure. So we find ourselves imposing, you could say, getting out over our skis, imposing a structure on the world that may not be there. And we find that in this story. So this starts to explain why, despite the fact that this story isn't empirical, There's a profound logic to why we're getting this story in the first place. If it's not a reflection of the nature out there, it's a reflection of what's going on in here and the needs we have in here. So we've seen the three central questions that Origin Myths attempts to answer. Let's be very clear, and this draws on Cass, that the questions being answered from chapter to chapter are very clear and specific, and it lets you know exactly why these chapters of Genesis have been broken down as chapters which stand distinct from one another, right? So you can see a real crystalline clarity of thinking of how, as we advance from one chapter to the next, we're getting different questions answered, we're dealing with different themes, and we're looking at things from a different perspective. What's fascinating about chapter 1 is that we're looking on the creation almost from a non-anthropological or non-anthropocentric perspective. We're looking at it from the point of view, almost of God's point of view, of what is, right? So chapter 1 answers the big cosmological, metaphysical, or ontological questions. Cosmology and cosmogony, two words that are obviously related. Cosmos. Ology has to do with the logic of the cosmos, like the structure of it, and its laws, you could say. And cosmogony has to do with the birth, goni, has to do with the birth, Greek, the birth of the cosmos, or its origins, right? So those two questions are answered. Metaphysical, we mean things that are beyond the material world. Metaphysical, the issues are things that are literally beyond the physical. So therefore, God is this metaphysical force that brings the material, the physical, into existence. Ontological, these are all kind of related concepts here. Ontological, onto, in Greek, toon means to be or being. So ontological questions have to do with the nature and structure of what is, of being itself, right? The first question of ontology is, what is there? And the second question is, how is it arranged? And what are the laws that it functions by? In chapters 2 and 3, we see a decided turn to a more anthropocentric perspective, right? Which is to say, issues that deal with our needs as human beings in our lives, ordinary lives. So we get moral, social, and political questions. What is the human being? What is my role in society? What is my role as a husband or wife? What is the community that we are part of? How should we act? These kinds of questions. How should we live? Sorry for the spelling here. Chapter 1, philosophical questions that are not practical, right? Non-anthropocentric. This is not a story that's primarily about us, even as the human being gets put at the pinnacle in dominion over the earth. And ironically, as the capstone, Adam and Eve may be the capstone, but they're also kind of, I don't want to say an afterthought, because they're clearly, the whole story is building up to them. But there's not much time spent talking about Adam and Eve, and there's no time talking about their life in any dimension, right? That doesn't happen until chapter 2. So in chapters 2 and 3, we get a practical or anthropocentric perspective, one that is based on the needs of our lives, right? So as we've seen, to just put a fine point on this, chapter 1 is designed to raise and answer big questions of our existence. These are philosophical or theoretical questions. What does that mean? These are questions involving our passive reflection on the world for the sake of our own knowledge and curiosity, rather than questions about what should be done in our lives, how should we live, which are practical questions. And those questions result in answers that involve taking concrete actions, right? So how should I live? When I answer the question of how should I live, I'm then going to execute that in my actions. But when I ask the question, what is the nature of the cosmos? It leads to knowledge and understanding, but it doesn't necessarily, or in any obvious way, lead to a certain type of conduct. Important. These questions in chapter 1 are not everyday questions, particularly because they don't seem, who has time to ask them, and they don't seem to be helpful or relevant to the needs of our daily lives, or because the very asking of them is a profound complication to our lives. And I think part of the problem of asking them, especially when we interrogate this story, is we discover that the answers are much more murky than the questions. And when they come up to be murky, and the answer to these questions would serve as the foundation of our existence, when we don't have those answers, we don't have the foundation. So instead of asking those questions, we accept a shorthand, or we accept a dogma about what they may be, because that's more cognitively satisfying, and maybe we need that for the sake of living. That's something Nietzsche talks about in his book called The Birth of Tragedy. So these questions instead satisfy our curiosity and intellect, but not our practical everyday needs. And this creates a fundamental tension between the need for truth, because we're capable of knowing the truth, versus the needs of life. And the need for truth and the need of life, and we'll see this in later things we study, later texts, we'll see that there's a fundamental conflict between this truth, because we discover that the truth and life are not simply or easily compatible with one another. What if, for example, we learn that there is no special meaning to anything? That is not going to positively benefit our life. Our life, to be successful in however we define that, is going to be motivated by believing that what we're doing is of great worth, and therefore we're willing to work hard, we're willing to sacrifice, we're willing to suffer the inevitable suffering in life, right? So if the truth is, life's a bitch and then you die, why make it hard on yourself? Why make those sacrifices? Raises at least the specter of those kinds of questions. And here's a scene from a movie that precisely raises these kinds of questions. And I can't play it because YouTube will very quickly be able to find it and block my video. But this is a scene from Woody Allen's Annie Hall, in which Alvy Singer, which is the Woody Allen-like character, here he is as a kid in Brooklyn, in Coney Island, and he's not doing his homework. Why? Because he's thinking about the expanding universe and what he doesn't understand what it expands into. And basically for him, he's discovered after learning about the universe that life is a bunch of sound and fury signifying nothing, to quote Shakespeare. And therefore, why do anything? Why live? Why do anything? Right? So, I think his mother says something like, and what does this all have to do with you finishing your homework? Right? So you see the challenge here, and it's very funny. That makes its point. I want to go into the three aspects of the world that are answered by creation myths beyond just these three questions. And I'm not going to read all this, but I want to highlight it. First, a creation myth deals with cosmogony, which I've already talked about, which deals with how things came to be, how they were born, cosmogony, literally the cosmos being born. How does that happen? So your answer is in the beginning, Genesis. Creation myths typically deal with what is also called theogony, right? Which is the birth and descent of the gods. And one thing that's interesting here is for example, pagan cosmogony or creation myth, right? Cosmogony and theogony are one. What is theo? Theo means Dios, God, right? In ancient Greek and Roman pagan religion and mythology, the natural forces of the universe are understood as gods, as anthropomorphizations of natural forces within the world, whereas In the biblical tradition, God is outside of nature because he's the being that creates nature, right? The fascinating thing is these natural forces are seen as being created by a descent of the gods, particularly male and female gods procreating and generating out of sexual reproduction a succession of beings and entities that leads up to the present, right? So the one thing you notice that's very conspicuous compared to Hesiod's Theogony, for example, as a Greek poet, is that there's only one God here, and creation, the power of birth and creation, is done by a male God, and there are no male and female dyads sexually reproducing to create the world, right? In fact, he creates everything as an artist, and there is no theogony in the biblical tradition. Last dimension of an origin myth is to explain the origin of evil, or what's called theodicy. So you see one very obvious problem. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, things are good. Day 6, things are very good. You notice there's light and there's dark, there's moon and there's sun, there's heaven and there's earth, but you notice there's no good and evil. And it's not till chapter 2 where it's discussed the emergence or the existence of two trees, one of them being the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so the question becomes, where, in this perfect order, this very good order, where does evil come from? Right? This is a mysterious question. The traditional theological answer is God is good, and therefore evil cannot come from God. But the problem with that is that it comes from his creation. He creates nature and its laws, and obviously within the natural world, not in his world, but in the natural world of man and earth, evil exists, and it raises the question of what is the cause of evil. And there's another complication with that, which is that on one hand, evil does seem to emerge from man's freedom. When he sets this whole cosmos in motion, it's a watch that's in perfect harmony with itself, and that makes it good and very good. We might say structurally, but also morally, right? It's a just system. He treats Adam and Eve justly before they sin, and actually that's just what they get punished, which is a function of justice too. Number one, Adam and Eve have the power of choice. They have the power to deviate from the order that's set up, precisely as a feature of their nature, something that, in light of the nature of all the other beings, they are not capable of deviating. So we could say that evil, the locus of evil rests in man. On the other hand, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is something that grows out of the ground, something that Cass talks about. And it seems to be a feature or a product of the natural world, in a sense even independent of man, because it's not till we pick of the fruit that we become aware. And of course, it all depends on how literal or how metaphorical you want to take this tree, and it creates some interesting problems. So what does Genesis mean? Well, it means beginning, right? Important, this is a Greek word. In the original, the Old Testament, written in Hebrew, and the Hebrew word is parashit, or parashah, and it means beginning, in the beginning of something. The two common translations of the first part of the first verse of Genesis is in the beginning God created heaven and earth, or when God began to create. And you see that in the beginning creates the interesting problems. In the beginning of what? Right? When God began to create, the beginning and his beginning to create are simultaneous with one another. Beginning means origin or birth. It implies that there was a beginning. That's important. We take that for granted, I think. It also implies, because we think of Genesis, we think of generate, we think generations all come from this word Genesis, which imply things like growth, development, the cycles of nature, the structure of life, birth, death, and rebirth. If something is born, it dies. If there is a beginning, an end is implied. So the very concept of Genesis or beginning implies a narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. This beginning, middle, and end highlights the finitude of things. The world that's created, that man lives in on planet Earth, is, as the Bible understands it, finite, with a dome at the top and dry land at the bottom. But so too is time. So time and space are finite. They're going to have a beginning and they're going to have an end. And if we think about our needs psychologically, when things are infinite or indefinite, that's profoundly unsettling for human beings. When things are finite, that is precisely when we're able to grasp them, because they have definite limits, parameters, boundaries. So Genesis, or beginning, means the story of the Bible begins at the ultimate beginning, and that the plot and the narrative are in harmony with one another. The text literally performs the meaning of its title. The text begins, and so does the universe. So we begin at the beginning, and it turns out we begin at the beginning of everything, right? In terms of the plot. The narrative and the text starts with the word beginning, which is also resides structurally at the beginning of the text. Important to see here how the structure of the language is trying to imitate the structure of the creation and then its overall order once it's created. The problem for us is we conceive of a beginning happening within a context. Normally when there's a beginning, there was some kind of before that precipitated the beginning. I don't know, the ref blew the whistle and threw up the ball at the opening tip of the basketball game. That was the beginning of the game. It was a precipitating cause of the beginning. For us, typically, a beginning implies a context in which the beginning happens, which is to say time, space, and stuff. The problem here, it's in the beginning of what? There is nothing. There's so little stuff that there's not even stuff for stuff to be in, which is there's no time and space. That is a crucial thing. We're not just talking about there was a void, right? There was literally nothing. So now I'd like to talk about the difference and also some of the similarities between the biblical explanation of the origin of things, and the scientific explanation today and also in the ancient world, right? Science has been with us for a long time in slightly different forms, but its key features have almost always been the same since science really developed in ancient Greece, starting in the 7th century BC with natural philosophy. So here we're talking about the distinction between science and the biblical tradition, and we could talk about it as the distinction between Jerusalem, biblical tradition on one hand, and Athens, the city-state in ancient Greece that represents the philosophic or the scientific tradition. And it creates a dividing line between religion or religious explanations or religious mythoi on the one hand, and philosophy and also science and their scientific or philosophic logoi or explanations of the world. So one is rooted in the light of faith and the other rooted in the light of reason. One is rooted in the acceptance of miracles, which a miracle by definition is something that defies the laws of physics, and it defies natural causation. And of course science depends on, it must posit a theory of cause and effect to be able to observe natural phenomena and predict them and reproduce them and so on and so forth. So the question now we ask is, what do scientists today say about the origins of everything? And of course, we all know what it's called. It's called the Big Bang. So let's go back to 1931, because in 1931, Bertrand Russell was saying essentially what remains the predominant position in those who are theorists and scientists of the Big Bang theory. He said in 1931, the view that the universe had a beginning in time at some not infinitely remote period. There is no reason whatever why the universe should not have begun spontaneously, except that it seems odd that it should do so. Now, here we have one of the most renowned philosophers of science and mathematicians of the 20th century saying that the cosmos had a beginning, and then he says it was spontaneous. What is he saying? He's saying nothing, nothing, something. That's exactly what spontaneous means. Generated out of itself, but there's, of course, nothing to generate out of itself to make, right? And he says, except that it seems odd that it should do so. And the reason it seems odd, this is what you call understatement. The reason it seems odd is because a cosmos generating itself spontaneously out of nothing at the beginning is fundamentally contrary to all the basic principles and axioms of science that make scientific inquiry and understanding even possible, right? He continues, to infer a creator is to infer a cause, right? Science, by definition, is the science of cause and effects, understanding the causal chain, cause, effect, and so on and so forth. To infer a creator is to infer a cause, and causal inferences, we're making inferences, are only admissible in science when they proceed from observed causal laws. Creation out of nothing is an occurrence which has not been observed. There is, therefore, no better reason to suppose that the world was created by a creator than to suppose that it was uncaused. Either equally contradicts the causal laws that we can observe. So what is he saying? He's dismissing the notion that there needs to be a cause to create an uncaused event. Do you see what the problem is here? He still acknowledges in this paragraph that the universe is without a cause, because that's what it means to be created out of nothing by definition, and that you don't need a God creator to be the cause of something that is uncaused. You see, first of all, this is totally unintelligible. It's a tautology. He's just claiming that it's uncaused, right? And he says, well, therefore you don't need a God because it's uncaused. But, I mean, honestly, if we think of just intuitively, positing a cause like God or whatever is more scientific than positing that there was no cause to an effect, because that violates the fundamental bounds of science. And he, of course, acknowledged that. He says, we've never seen it. This is all inference. And he says, obviously, the creation, the very notion of beginning implies nothing, nothing, something. There's no two ways about it. And he acknowledges that that violates the fundamental causal laws that we can observe. Observing those causal laws and characterizing them is the basis of science. And yet he's still claiming, he is asserting the claim that, the universe was without a cause, and therefore had a beginning. Doesn't make sense. But, oh, Professor Smith, that was 1931. That was like the Dark Ages, man. Nobody knew anything. That was like the Depression, and like people just, they didn't even have cell phones. That was the Stone Ages. Show us something today, Professor. Don't pull our legs by, selectively quoting from a scientist who, he probably, when he was sick, he probably went to have his blood let or something like that. Well, here's 2018 Stephen Hawking. And I'll read the first quote, which is entirely unequivocal from his book, Brief Answers to Big Questions. We're asking big questions. I didn't know that big questions had brief answers, but okay. And he says the exact same thing, number one, but then he goes on subsequently to contradict himself. And these statements, the first one comes from a book that I have, and the other ones come from statements he made in interviews. So he's not consistent, and he even acknowledges his inconsistencies. But my point is, his first statement is, I think the universe was spontaneously created out of nothing, according to the laws of science. Right? In the second statements, he goes on to qualify and equivocate. The problem is, no scientist should, and I don't even think can, make the statement he makes in the first one. I think the universe was spontaneously created of nothing according to the laws of science. Now, first of all, spontaneous creation is denied by the very logic that makes science possible, number one. Number two, if something was created spontaneously, like literally nothing to something, you cannot possibly have the laws of science being responsible for that spontaneous creation, because what is being created when everything, nothing, nothing, something, right? The laws of physics themselves are being created. This is a contradictory claim and a preposterous one. But then he goes on. He says, events before the Big... And here's an honest answer that I think is something that we could certainly countenance, but then it suggests something very different than what he's previously said and really contradicts it. Events before the Big Bang are simply not defined. Well, of course they're not defined, because we only know them, as Bertrand Russell says, through inference. Because there's no way one could measure what happened at them. Since events before the Big Bang have no observable consequences, how does he know that? I mean, how does he know we can see everything up to the Big Bang but not before it? I mean, how does he know that? One may as well cut them out of the theory and say that time began at the Big Bang. So here he's saying time began at the Big Bang. This is just a convenient way to look at things, but it's not the truth. This immediately opens the door toward, obviously there was something before the Big Bang, because something came from something. And it means that time did not have a beginning, but it was eternal. So I don't understand the nature of his equivocation. He could have many motives for saying this, folks. On one hand, he could say this is the scientific attitude. On another hand, he'd say there could be moral or ethical reasons why he states this, or rhetorical reasons. Then he says it was always reaching going back in time toward the Big Bang. Time was always reaching closer to nothing, but didn't become nothing. There was never a Big Bang that produced something from nothing. It just seemed that way from mankind's point of view. Now notice he put seemed, right? So this is a statement that to me is scientific, in that it seems like the beginning, but there really wasn't. But if we're saying to ourselves, it seemed like there was a beginning, then why aren't we simply asserting the fact that there was something before the beginning, which is to say before the Big Bang, and that the Big Bang is the beginning of our state of the universe, but it's not the beginning of the universe itself, right? And for some reason he doesn't feel comfortable saying that, but how does this all square with his first statement, where he explicitly says, I think the universe was spontaneously created out of nothing according to the laws of science? These are not compatible with one another. So, well, that's just Stephen Hawking, Professor. Why don't you show us another scientist? Because, you know, Stephen Hawking, he's just a pop scientist, right? Well, let's turn to one of the most famous physicists at Harvard University, Lawrence Krauss. He wrote a book published in 2013 called A Universe from Nothing. And Richard Dawkins, another famous evolutionary biologist and scientist, wrote an afterword in which he says this. And he's a friend of Lawrence Krauss, and he knows what Krauss is thinking, and if he has any questions about it, he can ask Krauss to clarify. He says the title means exactly what it says, and what it says is devastating. And the profound irony here is when Richard Dawkins claims that the universe came from nothing, what he really means is it didn't come from God, because Richard Dawkins is a famous atheist. The problem is, if something came from nothing, you need a God to create it, because scientifically, something only comes from something. So there's a real problem here in these explanations, and I don't know if they're being honest with us, but this is what they claim to believe. And this is some quotations by Dawkins as well. Even the last remaining trump card of the theologian, why is there something rather than nothing, shrivels up before our eyes as you read these pages, meaning Krauss's book. If On the Origins of Species, Darwin's book, was biology's deadliest blow to supernaturalism, we may come to see a universe for nothing as equivalent for cosmology. The title means what it says, and what it says is devastating, right? So he claims here that a universe from nothing actually refutes God, and yet claiming that the universe comes from nothing, from my logical point of view, scientific, it would actually necessitate something like a God for that to even happen. Totally unintelligible. Let's clarify what these scientists are saying. They're saying that the very dimensions intelligible to us, space, time, and matter, energy, were created out of nothing and did not exist at all prior to this beginning. They're saying that the laws by which all these elements operate were created at this moment and did not exist in any prior form, and therefore there could not have been laws to generate the laws, because there were none. They're saying that there was an effect that was generated without a cause, and they openly admit this. Even Genesis does not claim something so preposterous. Genesis claims that God was the cause, or as Aristotle called God, the prime mover, the first cause that set everything into motion. He's known as the first cause in Aristotle. In these philosophical questions, we ask, what sounds more plausible to you? Something coming from nothing, happening naturally and spontaneously, so-called. I'm not sure that is natural. It is not natural for something to come from nothing. It is not natural for something to be spontaneously generated. That does not compute. Or does it make more sense to say a creator created something from nothing because he had those intrinsic powers? So you esteemed Harvard professors are telling me with a straight face that matter creates itself from nothing. It creates itself by itself even when there is nothing to do the creating, right? Because, of course, the Plato comes into existence, but there was no Plato to bring itself into existence. It just, you see the problem here. How does nature on its own create its own matter and its own laws? How does this square with Newton's laws of matter and energy, which his basic principle is the conservation of matter and energy? Neither created nor destroyed, so there cannot be a beginning. There is perpetuity, eternity. What I'm really saying here is that scientists are positing something even more miraculous than the story of God's creation in Genesis. They're stating that matter and energy can generate themselves out of nothing with no external cause in a manner that violates the most basic and fundamental principles of science and scientific explanation. They are positing an effect without a precipitating cause. The only two alternatives to such a story are either there was a God who created or caused everything, or that there was no beginning and matter and energy have been in constant states of fluctuation for eternity. And for some reason, that is not a position. That seems to be the true scientific position, that matter and energy are permanent in state of fluctuation for eternity, but for whatever reason, they refuse to take up that point of view. Let's take up the other dimension of the problem of science. And here are problems that science would readily admit in terms of what they claim to know. Of course, their conclusion would be that the kinds of questions you really want answered are bad questions. And I would say, no, they're not. So what does science answer? And answer very well. It answers what is there, right? A diversity of beings, and in the language of mathematics and quantification. Solid, gas, liquid, this much, this dense, that not dense, fluctuations of energy. What is the order of what there is? It answers that question very well. What are the laws by which they operate? Physical, chemical, and biological. And of course, there's something called quantum mechanics, which I'm not terribly familiar with. But it seems to have many mysterious properties of its own. And quantum mechanics doesn't seem so much like laws by which the world actually operates. It seems like laws imposed by science that when you apply them to elements of the subatomic world, they work, but they don't really understand whether they're accurate, right? Look at the model of an atom, for example. It's not a perfectly correct representation of an atom, but when you work on an atom in relationship to that model, you yield results. So you say the model's good. How do things come to be, which is to say, what are their physical processes? So science is great with the knowledge it has, and of course it doesn't have all the facts at its disposal, but it's pretty good at piecing together physical, biological, chemical processes, so on and so forth. Very, very good at those things. So what are some of the problems? First challenge is that science wants to translate its measured quantities of time, space, and energy. It must ultimately translate those findings into natural language as a way to explain them. But the moment it starts explaining itself in many ways, it starts to enter in on the literary. It starts to enter in on making prudential judgments about how to understand the quantities that it discovers. Science, as we've seen, does not ask the why question, does not ask the purpose question, right? Why did I get cancer, right? And the answer is your genes. You've got bad genes. And you say to the doctor in response, but that's not the kind of question of all the people on the cosmos, why was it me rather than somebody else? Science doesn't claim to ask or answer this question because it's abandoned final causes and only talks about or addresses efficient causes. Science doesn't ask what is the meaning of, what is the significance, or what is the worth. Now these start to be questioned. When we say meaning, significance, particularly the issue of worth, this is really crucial. One of the stories that comes out of Genesis chapter 1 through 3 is the establishment of the fundamental dignity of the human being. And there's serious consequences when you're unable to establish the source, the foundation of the dignity of the human being. So science engages in what's called the fact-value distinction. Science confines itself to the is rather than the ought. The empirical is what is there rather than what should we do, what ought we do, right? It confines itself to the descriptive and not the normative. The normative statements have to do with what you should do or what you ought to do rather than, and description deals with characterizing what is the case, right? People murder, we see it empirically every day, but a human being should not murder another human being in light of what they are as human beings, and so on and so forth. The empirical and the moral are two different realms, which is really, we're talking about the distinction between the material world and the moral world. Kant famously said, you know, there's the heaven stars above and the moral law within, acknowledging what he thought was the rift between scientific facts and moral, you could say, opinions, because for science there are no moral facts. There are only moral opinions. So, in light of that, let's look at some of the consequences of the scientific point of view on human identity and our place in the world. Nietzsche gives this wonderful expression in the book The Will to Power, his late notebooks. It says, since Copernicus, man has been rolling away from the center to an X. From the center to an X. Copernicus established the heliocentric model that the sun was at the center of our solar system, and I think he thought the universe as well. Of course, the Earth is not the center of our solar system, it's the sun, and then of course our sun is not the solar system at the center of anything, right? It's just floating out in expanding indefinite space, right? So in the biblical story, we're at the center of things. And that physical location of being at the center has semantic meaning and value. It puts us semantically at the center. Our worth is identified as being at the center. It's significant, and it's also knowable and identifiable. So what's been happening to us as we understand the true nature of the universe? We move from the center of things to an X. And this is a physical displacement that is also a displacement in the intelligibility of where we are. It's a displacement in terms of our status in the world, our dignity, our worth, our meaning, right? An X of course is anything, right? It's just a variable. It's an unknown. So Pascal asks, in keeping with this line of thinking, he says, what is man in infinity? Well, I think, what is the center of infinity? Man's supposed to be at the center. What is the center of infinity? Well, there's no such thing as the center of infinity. Anywhere is everywhere. Either everywhere is the center or nothing's the center, right? So there's no special dignity to the human being. Human beings in the earth are just stardust, or as Carl Sagan says, star stuff, floating in an infinite yet ever-expanding universe on a little hunk of dust, just the byproduct of the creation and destruction of stars. Therefore, there's no purpose. We are just replicating genes, and mankind has no special dignity and no distinct. So it's one thing to say we're not at the center, but what justifies even saying that we have a higher dignity than another animal or than a blade of grass? And you say, oh, that's chauvinistic, that's anthropocentric, to posit that a human life is more valuable than a blade of grass. Well, let me tell you, if we equated a human life with a blade of grass, then people would do all types of even more awful things than they already do to each other, under the assumption that there was nothing special being done in mowing that blade of grass. So here I've given you a little clip that characterizes this quite beautifully, Carl Sagan's Cosmos. I encourage you, it's a few minutes long, I encourage you to watch it. And if I haven't penetrated your cranium enough and tried to discourage you and make you feel desolate and nihilistic and that there's no meaning in the world, all of existence is absurd, let me give you some other facts. So, of course, Darwin said that man is not made in the image of God, like chapter 1 of Genesis, but rather he's a cousin of the apes. Recently, a professor, Franz de Waal, said this: Darwin didn't go far enough. We are apes in every way, from our long arms, our tailless bodies, to our habits and our temperaments. We're nothing more than apes, the scientist says. It's a rather stunning claim, because we may have only a sliver of difference from the apes, but that sliver of difference ends up being a gigantic difference, depending on how we look at it. Another professor says, chimps and human beings are 96% the same. And what that really means is 96% of our genes are the same. But I would say that 4% difference in genes makes us, as a whole, very different. But they don't necessarily recognize it that way, is the point. Notice, domesticated cattle share about 80% of their genes with humans. We're just cattle. We're sheep. That's all we are. We share most of our DNA with cats, cattle, and mice. April 6, 2018. So maybe you deserve to be treated like cats, cattle, and mice, right? Then think of your own individuality. Of our 3 billion base pairs of genes, only a tiny amount are unique to us between humans, making about 99.9% of us genetically exactly the same to the guy next to us. Well, in some ways that's not surprising, because what distinguishes us a lot is not our genes, but our nurture rather than nature. And so we have no individuality if you go based on this analysis. And then it gets even better. If you think you're unique from fruits and vegetables, think again. We share more than half of our genetic code with a banana. In ancient Greek and Roman science, however, one of the very dominant views was that there was no beginning and that everything was eternal. Now, this is part of the Roman poet Lucretius. This is his poem called On the Nature of Things, and it's in the form of a poem, and it's dedicated to Venus, but yet it's really a kind of scientific explanation of the day, such as they were, trying to explain the phenomena of the world. The first thing you notice about this story is Venus is the progenitor of everything, and she makes it beautiful and fecund and so on. Of course, Venus is the goddess of love and beauty, and you can see that here she sits at the root of nature and all its forces, a very positive image. But the interesting thing is, this starts out in a poetic context of poetic imagery of gods and goddesses, but then very quickly it drops away, and you realize that his discussion of Venus as the progenitor of everything is just a kind of poetic technique, and that's not really his true scientific attitude or outlook or account. So this first little snippet here is a mythos. But the mythos isn't being taken seriously as anything other than just kind of poetry, pretty speech, right? Because then he transitions to a logos. And Lucretius says this. He says, these, in the language of philosophy, it is our custom to describe as matter. So he's trying to explain what are the fundamental, so we shift from a religious and poetic mode to a philosophical and scientific mode. These things he's trying to describe are what he calls in the last line here as the beginnings from which everything in the universe is formed. And what are those beginnings from which everything is formed? Atoms. But his use of the word beginning here is very different from in the beginning God created heaven and earth. And we'll see why in a second. He says these things in the language of philosophy rather than poetry, it is our custom to describe as matter, right? So he says everything that exists for Lucretius is the material world. There is no supernatural world, number one. Number two, he's going to say it all comes from atoms. He describes them as the generative bodies or seeds of things, or they call them primal atoms, since from them, those first beginnings, everything is formed. So atoms are the generative bodies, they're the seeds, right? That's a metaphor. And they are the first beginnings from which everything is formed. So what are atoms? They are the substrate from which all other material things are made. And of course you're sitting there saying, well, that's correct. That's exactly right. But what does he mean by beginnings? He doesn't mean in the beginning, temporally, there were atoms and then everything was formed. What he's saying is that as a substrate, atoms are the base that provide the beginning for every other type of object in the world or entity or being in the world. So they're the beginnings, just like a seed. When a seed becomes a plant, obviously there was a cause, something that precipitated a something else. So the atoms are permanently existing things. They don't get created into existence. And he makes that only more clear in the next passage we'll briefly look at. He says, we start then from her, and he's talking about Venus, but what he's really talking about is nature. He's using just a metaphor here, and he means it metaphorically. He doesn't mean it literally. God, of course, is not a metaphor in the ancient Hebrew Bible. It's to be taken absolutely literally. We start then from her great principle, that nothing ever by divine power comes from nothing. Right? So this is you would call it an atheistic point of view. And therefore, Venus is just the way we would understand her, like an interesting literary character, not a real being in any way. Certainly there's no supernatural. So he says, nothing ever comes from nothing, especially not by divine power, because that's the only way you could make it happen. Right? So what does that mean? It means that he accepts the eternity of the cosmos. And we'll look at that in just a second. It says at the bottom here, the object of our search, both the source from which each thing can be created. And here the word created is, I think the word made is really more appropriate. Each thing can be created, and in the manner in which things come into being, they come into existence without the aid of gods. What is the object of research? It's really nature, or maybe even atoms as the primal substrate of nature. That's what he's investigating, and he believes all the things that exist don't come from God's creating them, but become from these primordial substrate called atoms. So now we come full circle and approach this mystery of nothing, nothing, something, and the implication of it. So here we have, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. We've heard it many times now. It implies a beginning to everything. It implies an effect without a cause. Here, if we look at this structure, you see the problem. Finite time. Right? There must have been a beginning, here's a middle, and here's the end. Say, the end times, the book of Revelation in the New Testament. Right? But a finite time implies a beginning, but a beginning implies something coming from nothing. If something doesn't come from nothing, let's be cute, it comes from something. And that something is a precipitating cause. And if that cause exists, it must have been caused by something else, and it must have an effect. So therefore, as you keep inquiring into the causes of things, you keep traversing back and back in time, ultimately indefinitely. And if you accept the principle of something coming from something, and that nothing comes from nothing, you must logically, by necessity, accept the principle of the eternity of the universe. And that thought is increasingly disturbing, because now our life exists within this ever-expanding, almost Mobius strip going out both ends, in which our life gets smaller and smaller. As things expand out, our significance almost vanishes asymptotically to nothing. Here you see the structure, and this actually will be very important, this diagram here, when we look at John Milton and looking into the causes of things. So let's say this is the beginning. Excuse me, this is the beginning, the effect. Well, if we're thinking scientifically, there must have been a cause. But that cause then is understood also as the effect of a previous cause, and that cause the effect of a previous cause, and so on and so forth back indefinitely. So you can see. And what is science? Science, by its very nature, is the study of causes and their effects. The very notion that science would investigate effects that have no cause, that's what's called a miracle. That's totally unintelligible. So, was there a before the beginning? The ironclad law of cause and effect is the basis of all scientific knowledge and logic. If there is an effect, there must be a cause. If there is no cause, there is no effect. These are the basic tenets of all science, because it's basic logic. Nothing comes from nothing, and something always comes from something else. This is the basis of all logic and the principle of non-contradiction, which says that something cannot both be and not be at the same time. And in Latin, what Lucretius says is ex nihilo nihil fit. Nothing comes from nothing. The very idea of biblical creation is ex nihilo. It is creation out of nothing. But of course, it's acknowledged up front that God is performing a miracle. So, and God by nature is a being who can perform these types of acts. So, at the very least, the Genesis story is much more intelligible and logical in its claims than science, which actually, of the Big Bang, which they seem to actually be undermining all the fundamental tenets of science in claiming what they're claiming, while at least the biblical tradition is consistent, because they're claiming that by definition it is a miracle. Let us conclude with this fundamental distinction between creating and making, as the King James Bible translates these terms, right? In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The first time he makes man and woman, he creates them. The second time they are made. There are many things that are just made, you will see. Creating is creation out of nothing. It's creation ex nihilo. Right? That's a miracle, that's a mystery, and that's only what God can do. Right? Making is taking what's already in existence and forming it. So, science, as I would think, cannot talk about the concept of creation. It's not permitted by the very nature of the rules of the discourse of science. Right? Everything in science should be making, or transformations of matter and energy into different forms, and therefore they must posit the eternity of the cosmos. But of course, if you start thinking through the implications, maybe this is how we'll finish up, the implications of eternity, you come across some rather unpleasant thoughts. And we'll leave it with this, it only enhances the insignificance, the meaningless, the nihilism, the absurdity of human life, and all the trials and tribulations that we undergo as part of it, and makes them seem utterly meaningless. Right? On a happy thought, when we come back in the next lecture, we will look at the specific structure and the types of beings God creates, and we will look in this structure for the source, the kernel of problem, and that problem will be in mankind, and its specific nature as a special type of being who lives and functions in a certain way. Thank you.